With the recent announcement of the Super Nintendo Classic Mini, Nintendo nostalgia hype is full steam ahead, and speculation has started to stir about the possibility that a Nintendo 64 or N64 Classic Mini could be the next announcement from Nintendo in the Classic line. This rumor isn't just out there, but it recently grew legs as Nintendo registered for a new patent on several of their older controller designs, including the N64. YouTubers and video game media outlets alike have been all over this topic recently, releasing article after article regarding if it could happen, when will we know, and of course, what games will be on the system. Of course, most people would see this as them cashing in on a hot topic, and my channel has much more integrity than that. Or maybe not, but I am going to look at this a little differently, and not focus on the games that I think should be on the system, but rather the ones I think you will be disappointed because they are not there. I'm MichaelBtheGameGenie, and these are 10 great games that won't be on the Nintendo 64 Classic. Resident Evil 2 is one of my favorite games of all time, and was my introduction to the series, and really the survival horror genre. From the minute I purchased it, my PlayStation rarely turned off until I saw the story through from start to finish. A few years later, it was ported on the N64, and I didn't see how they would be able to translate a game that was clearly made to be played on a CD-based system to the cart-based N64. Needless to say, I was pleasantly surprised by not only how well it played, but also how great it looked, as it retained the majority of the elements that made it such a special cinematic experience. Unlike a lot of other games I'll be covering on this list where I have hard facts on why you shouldn't expect to see it appear, this one is purely speculation based on the fact that Capcom is currently working on a Resident Evil 2 remake in the same vein of the excellent Resident Evil remake on the PS4, and I can't see them agreeing to let another version come out at the same time. TUROK was a huge release for the N64 as it was supposed to be the game on the system that brought in the mature gamers with its graphic gameplay. At a time when there wasn't a massive library for the N64, TUROK was a must-have for my brother and I, so much so that we both lied to our parents that we needed money for the fair, hid in the woods pretending to go to the fair for 4 hours before using the money to buy the game. I've always been impressed by the world that TUROK takes place in, and for its time it seemed like the future of gaming, but arguably it hasn't held up, and it is extremely plagued by all the fog to hide the level rendering. I've also always had a hard time with the controls, as I wasn't used to analog control sticks at this point, and it uses yellow directional buttons on the controller in a weird way that I just never gotten the hang of. Why won't this game see the light of day on the N64 Classic? Well, because TUROK is actually a licensed property based off a comic book, and in order for it to even be considered, royalties would have to be paid to the individual who owns the property before discussion could even ensue regarding Nintendo then paying the publisher to use the game for the system. I make no bones about it, Shadows of the Empire is still to this day my favorite Star Wars game. I'm not saying it's the best, and it's mostly nostalgia, but this was the first time as a Star Wars fan I was swept up into the world that I had loved from the movies. I like this game so much I covered it in a full review which you should totally go watch after you finish watching this. It was the first time I experienced these fantastic worlds from the movie in a 3D setting, and I loved the multiplayer modes that were included in the game, including the Battle of Hoth, which I believe is responsible for a game you will see later on in this list. Of course, much like the last title, this is a licensed property, owned by Disney, and if we didn't see one of the great Disney NES games on that Classic Edition, I hardly believe Nintendo will shell out the money necessary to put this game on the N64 Classic. Much like Resident Evil 2, Spider-Man was first released on the Sony PlayStation and then later ported to the N64. What is different in this case is it isn't merely a port of the PlayStation game that retains enough elements to still make it good, but arguably the definitive version of the game, albeit minus the FMV cutscenes. I had so much fun playing Spider-Man games growing up, but this is the first time I stopped and said, this is an excellent game, and does more than just let me beat up people as Spider-Man, but finally lets me be Spider-Man and explored the world with his full range of powers. Also, its style was based off of the excellent 90s Fox cartoon, which is my favorite iteration of Spider-Man, so this game really makes my spider sense tingle. Well, of course, this game is a licensed property based off a comic book character, based off a cartoon show, and owned by Disney. With all that weight holding it down, not even Spider-Man can crawl or web-sling out of that chasm. Perfect Dark on the N64 was the spiritual successor to Goldeneye, arguably the game that made everybody a fan of first-person shooters. The game stars a female protagonist, Joanna Dark, and has the same gameplay format as Goldeneye, except it is a considerably more polished game. The level design and graphics are just so much more appealing, and you can tell the developers had time to really learn how to use the system to its full potential, and even fuller as the game also made use of the expansion pack. I haven't played a ton of Perfect Dark as I wasn't really into FPS games at that time, but it was fun back then, and it's always been a game that I've been meaning to go back and play through. Maybe on the Xbox One through Rare Replay. And that is also why you can expect that you won't see it show up on the N64 Classic, because the rights are owned by Rare, aka Microsoft, who I hardly believe will strike a deal with a competitor here. Rogue Squadron is Star Wars, if it's just all spaceship battles. Are you sold yet? Well, everyone was. Taking arguably the greatest element of Shadows of the Empire and expanding it into its own game, the Star Wars franchise had a huge hit on its hands. I wasn't personally that into the series until the sequel was released on the Nintendo GameCube, but my brother sure was, and he played the hell out of it. The spaceship controls were excellent, and the power of the N64 allowed you to take control of the famous ships from the series and take part in epic, large-scale battles in the various planets and landscapes synonymous with the Star Wars franchise. I won't go into too much detail as to why this won't be included, because it's the exact same reason that Shadows of the Empire won't be included. But a lot more people are probably going to be disappointed by Rogue Squadron's absence. Of the games I am including on this list, there probably isn't one more sought after and expensive for N64 enthusiasts and collectors than CONKER'S Bad Fur Day. Almost an anomaly on the system due to its explicit and graphic nature, CONKER should be the stereotypical puffball mascot character we see in these platformers, but does he ever take a hard left? And this game is for mature audiences. While some of the humor may be a little outdated and distasteful to some, you have to give the game credit for being different, as it revolves around CONKER waking up from an alcohol-fueled night that he can barely remember, and having to retrace his steps to see what carnage he had caused, and let's be honest, we have all been there. This property unfortunately was a Rare title and owned by Microsoft, so we won't see it on the N64 Classic. And it seems, if Microsoft have their way, we won't see him ever again. At least not in anything good. Banjo-Kazooie hits me right in the feels, and I loved this game as a kid. I spent so much time playing Mario 64 and was hoping another game would come along in the same style, and then my prayers were answered and Banjo-Kazooie was released. I didn't hesitate and picked it up on release day. The characters looked so good, and the story they told in the game with Gruntilda was right up my alley, and it was just a pleasure to explore these beautiful 3D worlds. I have admittedly never finished the game, and it constantly laughs at me from my backlog as I know I need to go back and finally beat it. This for me is an essential title on the N64, and there is no excuse if there were no barriers not to include it. Unfortunately, it's a Rare title yet again, and owned by Microsoft, and the only thing they are apparently interested in is bastardizing the character in a crap fest like Nuts and Bolts. Well, at least I can play this on Rare Replay. And this is my personal favorite N64 game that I don't only think, but know won't be included on the N64 Classic Mini. Why is it my favorite? Because it's No Mercy, and No Mercy is still to this day the very best wrestling game ever made. Mark my words on that one, it will be written on my tombstone. There is no game that I personally or with friends spent so much time on. The wrestling was perfect, and never was it not enjoyable. The wrestlers' look and entrances were finally what they always should have been in a wrestling game. And let's not forget about that customization, as I have most of the roster from WCW created and in the game, as well as all their moves and likenesses from Revenge were included. God damn, this is a great wrestling game, but it will not, mark my words, be on the N64 Classic. Why, you ask? Well, to start, it's a WWE licensed game, so Nintendo will have to pay them for it, as well as THQ. Second, and if I'm not mistaken, in order for WWE to use all the characters from the original game, they would have to pay them as well, and some of these guys are embroiled in a concussion lawsuit against WWE, and I can't see them agreeing to a side deal here. I'm sure there are other issues as well, but that's enough to guarantee fans of this excellent portrayal of the Graps won't see it on the system. There is probably no game more synonymous with the N64 than Goldeneye. I'm serious. You ask almost anyone what do they remember about the NES or the SNES, and they will say Mario or Zelda. But if you ask someone about the N64, the nostalgia bubbles up and they say, man, playing multiplayer Goldeneye was the jam. I personally will never forget getting the first screenshots of this game in Nintendo Power, and you can tell that this wasn't going to be your typical throwaway movie game. No, this was going to probably be the boss of all movie games, and man oh man did it deliver. The controls were great and allowed first-time FPS players to masterfully take over the role of 007 and experience the story of GoldenEye on the N64. This was a system seller and one of my favorite games we got that Christmas. People are still playing GoldenEye to this day, and it's arguably the most desired game for the N64 Classic, but also the one that is the most likely that it will not be included. There are so many factors at play here, namely it's a licensed game, meaning the rights would have to be acquired for the characters and likenesses. And second, it was a rare game, meaning that there is little to no chance we will get to see Sean Bean die on the N64 Classic. Well, at least there is something he didn't die in. So those are my top 10 games that I think won't be on the Nintendo 64 Classic. Do you disagree with any of my choices and think they will make it? Or are there other games that you think should have been included on this list? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, thank you so very much for watching.